Hi students, your study guide here on in 175 on the final. The exam will open on 8 a.m. At 8 a.m. on Monday, May 11th, and it will close 3 days later, um, Thursday at midnight on May 14th. So next week this is happening. We're going to have 4, 5, 8, 6, and 7. Those 5 chapters. I'm going to go in that order because that's how they came in the on the videos. Wesh, lesson 4, language. Remember the power of language, the centrality of language to culture. We are working in what is called descriptive linguistics here. It's another field close to anthropology, but very different. Taxonomies. These are systems for organizing information. We have 9 elements of communication, but 2 of these are uniquely human. And this is important, that displacement and productivity are uniquely human forms, elements of communication. So displacement is we're talking about things. We use language to talk about things that are events that are displaced from us in time or in space. So we could talk about stuff that's happening in another town. We could talk about stuff that's happening in another country or on the other side of the world. And we can talk about things that happened last week or 1,000 years ago. We can talk about things that will happen in the future. Animals don't have that kind of language. They do have language, non-human animals do, but not displacement and productivity, according to this lecture. There are 5 elements of grammar. Grammar here refers to phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics. So phonetics is the vast number of different sounds that can be used or have been used in any and all languages. Phonology has to do with the limited number of sounds within your language. So a single language has a system that's called phonology, and these are distinguishable sounds. And the reason we know they're distinguishable is because you can use them. If you use one sound, it's one word, and if you use another sound, it's another word. Ball versus Paul. What did we use? Bark versus park, right? So because those are 2 different words, we know that pa and ba are 2 important sounds. But in other languages, they have different important sounds, and so different phonologies. Morphology has to do with when meaning is attached. So we have um, meaning attached to these sounds, and then we call them words. We call them words if they're free morphemes. Free morphemes can stand on their own, and those are words. Bound morphemes are just little particles. They have meaning, but they can't stand on their own. They have to be attached to a free morpheme. A tonal language is a language where the meaning changes, whether the tone is, if the tone is rising, it's one word. It's not like, we say, um, you know, hey, that's how was that class? It was okay. It was okay, right? So those are 2 different meanings, but they're not radically different, right? I mean, it takes some interpretation, but in a tonal language, okay would mean car, and okay would mean happy, right? Completely different word, depending on how you whether you had it falling or rising or in the middle, right? Perfect pitch. People who come from tonal languages where tone really matters, like Mandarin Chinese. More of them tend to have perfect pitch. That is, they can listen to the hum of the air conditioner out there and say, "Oh, that's a C flat," right? Um, Syntax is the 4th. Syntax is when we put these words in a sequence, and that um, makes sentences, and that's where we typically, in syntax, is where we typically think of grammar as beginning in grade school, right, with nouns and parts of speech and all that good stuff, subjects and predicates. But grammar is much bigger in descriptive linguistics. So syntax has to do with the order that words come in, which determines what their part of speech is, whether they're a noun or a verb or an adjective or an adverb. Um, syntax sentence, right? It's the same sort of root there. Um, Semantics has to do with larger systems of meaning, different kinds of speech, different ways of speaking. Whether you're joking, whether you're telling a story, whether you're giving instructions or directions, or doing greetings or taking leave or whatever. Um, linguistic relativity. Linguistic relativity says that different cultures speaking different languages can affect your perception. So, um, language and perception are very closely linked. Remember all of our talk about um, uh, colors and how we can see colors that we can name, and if you have more names for colors, then you see more colors because you can identify them. So language and perception are really closely connected. This is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Remember all the talk um, about uh, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis about colors, about insurance and all that, how we perceive things. Um, and then finally, let's see. So yeah, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and linguistic relativity; these are important. You'll want to focus on those. Speech variety versus language, dialect, register, accent. Remember, anthropologists like to talk about speech variety instead of talking about whether it's a language or a dialect, whether what kind of register they're using, with the accent. I mean, we talk about all these things, but we broadly put it all under speech variety. Marked versus unmarked. Remember, we've talked about this because of the Orokaiva, where you have marked versus unmarked, but we were talking here about accent. Do you have an accent? And if you say no, all that means is that your accent is unmarked, that you talk like everyone around you. If you have a marked accent, then you're noticed as talking funny, but that's only because you're living among people who speak differently than you do. So if you were living around people who talk like you do, then you wouldn't have a marked accent. You would still have an accent. You still talk the same way you talk, but it would be unmarked. Metaphors. He talked a little bit about metaphors, world weavers. The marked and unmarked is important. World weavers and world makers, and strengthness, and that's all good stuff. Wesh lesson 5, infrastructure. We have tools and technology, talking about the tools who make us, and then we make the tools, and then the tools remake us. Photography and entanglement, living in this world. The world until yesterday. So yesterday happened 12,000 years ago with the development of agriculture. Um, we have 4 basic economies: foraging, gardening, herding, and intensive agriculture. 4 basic political structures to match those economies: band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. So the lowest level is the foraging bands. These valued peace and equality, had a lot of leisure time, had good health. We cannot compare current hunter-gatherers to ancient human beings living hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. Why not? There's 2 important reasons here, and this is important, uh, that hunter-gatherers um, living today, if you look for them, you will only find them in very marginal environments. This is because they are small scale. They don't have powerful weapons. They don't have organization. They can't raise armies. And so they get pushed off the good land into the deserts, into the rainforests, and into the Arctic regions of permafrost. So that's where you find them today, for the most part, Pacific Islands as well. And Indian Ocean islands, other islands, island economies where there's no gold, there's no valuable cropland, there's nothing there. And once they discover gold or oil, then they kick those people off. So the point is that they are living in very different environments. 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, they were living in the richest river valleys, the nicest environments. So they had much better lifestyles, much better health, because they had better access to food. Number 2 is that there are no nearby states. So all hunter-gatherers today are kind of citizens of countries, even though they are not. Uh, they don't necessarily uh, enjoy all the benefits of voting and education and healthcare and all that. They don't get Social Security because, I mean, some of them do, in Alaska, for example, if you're in a rich country, you do get access to those resources, but maybe not as immediately as if you lived in a city. Um, and so 100,000 years ago, there was none of that. There were no nearby states to tell you what you are escaping from when you escape. So today, hunter-gatherers are all pretty much voluntary people who are living apart from the state because they don't like it. Um, and that adaptation of resistance is different than what was the case 100,000 years ago, where that's how everyone lived. There were no options, and that's just the normal way to live. Okay, I'm going to stop here with do not compare hunter-gatherers to ancient human beings, okay? We'll come back for the luxury trap.